Professor Shevell studies and her current research projects and examines the sources of citizenship policies in the post-communist states, church relations in Ukraine, the origins of separatist conflict in Donbass. Professor Shevell is the author of numerous monographs. She is the author of Migration, Refugee Policy, State Building in Post-Communist Europe Policy, and many, many others. We are very happy to welcome our dear guest in Vasilka Razin, Kharkiv National University. This is the 17th event of our ongoing project, A Lecture to Victory, Speakers of the World in support of Vasilka Razin, Kharkiv National University, Ukraine. Our dear guest will be talking and addressing our audience today, speaking about the application process to the US educational institutions. And I am very happy to greet dear guest on our premises. Hopefully, we will be able to do that in person in future. Today, I'm very happy to step down in favor of Professor Peshkova, Olga Peshkova, the Grant Manager of International Relations Office, Senior Lecturer of Mykola Lukash Translation Studies Department of Foreign Languages School of Vasilka Razin, Kharkiv National University. My dear colleague, I'm very honored to step down in your favor for the greeting word of our dear guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start with the words that I'm not a professor yet, but then I decided not to announce this aloud. But then I decided, thank you very much, Elena Viktorovna. Elena Viktorovna basically is my university lecturer. Thank you very much, Professor Shevell. We are really happy to greet you at our university, no matter whether online or offline, and definitely we hope that one happy day we will be able to meet you offline at our university. We definitely invite you, and we are looking forward to meeting you in person. Definitely, I, being a part of International Relations Office, have to answer some questions related to the process of applying for foreign educational institutions, and basically as for academic mobility and grant activities, basically almost every day. And the direction of studying at American higher educational institutions is really very topical for us. We really get rather many questions, and at the same time, we have to admit that we do not know much about the process of applying precisely to the educational institutions in the USA. So the topic is more than, I think that more than 200% topical for us. I'm sorry for such tautology. And definitely before the full-scale invasion, we understood and realized the importance of academic mobility and combining studying at our universities and foreign universities. But definitely after the 24th of February, we understand this more than before, and really appreciate all the help from our foreign colleagues in this direction. And at the same time, we can say that we are really very proud of our students who do not just quit being educated at Razin University and at Ukrainian universities, but despite the ongoing war, despite all the difficulties and obstacles, including, for example, I don't know, difference in time zones and so on, continue studying at several universities, at our university and at some of our foreign colleagues. So I'm sure that everybody understands, but I really want to emphasize that the topic is more than crucial for us. Thank you very much for your interest to our university, and we will be happy to get your input on this topic. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Peshkova and Professor Legada. I would be, as we discussed with you over email, I tried to include in my presentation both the kind of rules and regulations and some tips for undergraduate study, as also for graduate study, because the audience here, I understand, already undergraduate students, but some of them may be considering maybe potentially transferring, especially given, the difficult situation in Ukraine. So the undergraduate admission rules would apply also to the transfer students. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about specifically application for graduate studies. So after people already received their undergraduate degree and they continue to master's or PhD programs. And just with a caveat, since I'm in political science, what I'm going to say, especially about graduate school, really more applies to social sciences. So political science, sociology, history. I know less about hard sciences like chemistry and so forth. So there may be some, you know, again, not knowing ahead of time who the audience is, but just so the students know that if there are students from hard sciences, there may be things, you know, applicable to those fields that I don't know much about. So that just with that caveat. But otherwise, I'm very happy. Thank you for inviting me. As I was telling Professor Legeda, I'm certainly happy to take questions in Ukrainian from students, and, you know, they feel free to interrupt, but it's easier to kind of do the actual presentation about studying in the US in English. So yes, so let's basically get started without further ado. I'm going to share my screen, right? Is that okay? Let's see if I can, yes, I can share screen. Okay, so share screen, right. Can everybody see it? Yes, yeah, great, okay.
Absolutely.
So basically I'll start with some very basics, again, not knowing sort of what the audience knows, what the audience doesn't know. Certainly hope to leave plenty of time for questions. If some things I say, you know, everybody already knows, and maybe some things people have questions I did not include, but let's get started. Oops. Okay, so just to kind of, by way of a brief overview, like what does the education process in the United States looks like? So once people finish high school, that's our средня школа, I guess. That's the first 12 years of education. We in Ukraine, I think, are transitioning now from 11 to 12 years, right? Used to be 11, in the US it's 12. Then students continue to either receive a bachelor's degree and sometimes receive first associate's degree and then a bachelor's degree. So the bachelor's degree, which is the most probably typical route, is a 4-year degree. You receive it either at a college or at a university. So for that reason, there is no difference. Like sometimes, I think, again, from what I know, something that is called a college in Ukraine means something else. It's not really a higher education necessarily. That's not the case in the US. So if you are considering receiving a bachelor's degree or transferring into, you know, from Kharkiv, say, to some American institution, you certainly should be looking at both colleges and universities. There are excellent colleges. Harvard, in fact, awards undergraduate degree from a Harvard college. It is also part of Harvard University. So the main difference basically here is that colleges award just undergraduate degrees, and universities also award graduate degrees, PhDs and MAs. So for the purposes of applying for higher, like after bachelor's, it does matter. Not all colleges would have PhD, say, granting departments, but for the purposes of getting a bachelor's degree, it does not matter. So by all means, you should be considering both what's called college and what's called university. Now, this associate degree business, I'll say less about it, but I do want to mention it. This is basically, how shall I say it? Sometimes, let's say a student finished high school, but their grades are maybe not very good, or they may have had a break in their studies. Maybe they, you know, got married, had a child, had some other life circumstance, or they don't have the money. That's another, I'll talk about money later on. But you can go and start your education by receiving a 2-year associate's degree, which is often awarded both by colleges and also by something called community college, which is really like a local university, local study that is, you know, much cheaper. Usually students live at home, or they live, you know, with their families, and they might commute to college, get a 2-year degree. And then they could either finish with this. For example, some professions might, like, say, if you do accounting, you can, for example, do certain more technical professions with just associate's degree. You don't need a 4-year degree. Or oftentimes students then transfer to a college or university to continue to receive their bachelor's degree. So this is like, just to give you an example, like my older child, for example, is in a public school in the US. They have many immigrants, they have many poor students, they have students whose families like just don't even know about colleges. So some of these kids might go to get associate's degree first, get some required classes, improve their grades, and then continue to bachelor's. So this is usually not the route foreign students take, but sometimes it does happen. I actually had a student once who emigrated to the United States with a green card lottery. He started in a 2-year degree in a local college, then transferred to Taftsa University, where I now teach, received his bachelor's degree, and now is actually finishing his PhD. So certainly you can start, you know, this sort of low-level university and then continue. Now, once you receive your bachelor's degree, there are basically 2 higher degrees you can receive. One is a master's degree. You can receive, usually it's another 2 years of study in the United States after bachelor's, and you receive a master's degree. in all sorts of fields, anything from political science to law to public policy, international relations, all sorts of things. Or you can receive a doctorate degree. And here's a very important point. I will talk about it later once we get to the graduate degree. You do not need a master's degree to apply for a PhD program. This is something foreign students oftentimes don't know, because I think in Ukraine, like, I don't think you can receive, like, go study for kandidat nauk, right, if you don't have your magister first. But in the US, you can. So you can, right after finishing bachelor's degree, apply to PhD program. And that is actually a better route. I'll talk about it later. Why is that a better route? Because doctorate programs are usually free. If you get admitted to a good PhD program, you get full funding. University would pay you tuition and would give you either a stipend or some sort of teaching assistantship or research assistantship to cover your expenses. And master's degrees usually don't have the funding. So you would usually have to either pay yourself, get potentially loans. There are some programs that have funding, but they are few. So, and then furthermore, I'll also talk about it later, if you actually study in a PhD program, after the first 2 years of study, you receive your master's degree anyway. So you're not applying for a master's degree, you're applying for a PhD degree, you're admitted for a PhD degree, but after 2 years of study, you receive your master's degree as well. So this is something very important to keep in mind. I was actually just talking to a colleague who teaches at a PhD granting university in Wisconsin, in Madison, very good school. And she was saying that they have, unfortunately, like, not many students know, she feels this, that students who come from, especially former communist countries, from Europe, outside of North America, they just don't know that you can actually apply directly to a PhD program with a bachelor's degree. So again, we'll get back to that. So let me say a little bit sort of like, okay, there are thousands, many hundreds, I think there are thousands of colleges and universities in the United States. Like, how do you even choose? Like, what's a good school? What's an affordable school? What are some of the cost benefits? I'll mention a few general things, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the requirements and also financial end of things. Now, I am happy to share with Professor Legeda, or with a different email address if you prefer, this presentation, because all of these things I hyperlinked. So then if you then share it with your students can click on these links and follow them for more information. So just let me know afterwards if you want me to share this presentation. So how do you choose college, university? This is the advice that high school counselors give to American students, and I think for most part it's
Hello?
Yes. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, somebody's okay.
Could you please mute the microphone, guys? Sorry. Excuse me.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so things such as size, location, and type of school, I think are all important, because schools are very different. Some are in the big cities, if you want to be in New York, right, and you maybe want to go to Columbia or New York University. If you kind of like small town feel, right, there are plenty absolutely excellent colleges that are in tiny, small little towns when there is nothing else there pretty much other than a college life. There are some colleges that may have religious affiliation, right? There are some colleges that are known to be have more liberal, like, students and their students more conservative students. So that might also be important. I think starting with the geography is a good idea, because again, what part of the country do you prefer to be? You have to kind of get some sense about American geography. Like, Midwest is very different from Northeast. South is very different from Northwest. So these are the kinds of things that I think once you narrow down to this part of the country maybe and type of school, then you can start looking in some of these like this one, the US News and World Report College Ranking Guide, what are the good schools, highly ranked schools there. Now, there are many good colleges, many. It's not just about Harvard and Yale and Princeton. There are literally dozens and dozens of colleges where you can receive excellent education. But there are also some that just basically make money and don't really give their students all that much. How would you know if you're looking at a college like this? Very important criteria, I would say, is in the second block of bullets, the graduation rate. How many students actually finish and get their degree in 4 years, and usually graduation rate is reported for 4 years, 6 years, and 8 years. So I would say look for 4 to 6 years. If you have 97% of students graduating in 4 years, that's a good sign. It means the college actually cares about students, they get the education, they get support, and they actually finish. If you have graduation rate of 43%, I would not even be looking at those schools, because it basically means half of the students who start, they don't finish, right? It's like something is wrong there, right? Something is not quite, they're basically not providing the service that they're selling. Now, the prestige of the college is also important, I think. I don't think it's all about like the top 5, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, MIT. Certainly that's not all be all or end all. But good name matters, right? If then you're applying for jobs, you're applying for graduate schools. If you came from a school, which I think for each easily are like 60, 70 schools that, you know, would have this name recognition, that would be highly ranked in this US News and World Report. This is one of the most commonly used rankings. You can't really go wrong, right? Like people will recognize the name, employers would know the name, graduate programs would know the name. So I think it is worth your while to look at, if you're a strong student, at maybe the top, you know, 30, 40, 50 colleges, universities. In this ranking, you can see they rank universities separately, they rank colleges separately. And as I said, definitely look at colleges. Some of them are absolutely outstanding. They just means they don't award graduate programs, right? You can also do rankings for graduate schools, for law schools. There are all of these different categories, right? Now, another very important, I think, criteria to consider, especially if you are going to be spending any of your own money or potentially borrowing money or taking a loan or anything, what is the post-employment chances of getting a job and getting a decent salary? So this last thing here, the college scorecard, it is prepared by the US government. It is basically a website where you, once you put the college name, say you already like narrowed your search down to say maybe 10 to 15 schools, right? You can put each school down there in the college scorecard, and it will tell you what the average graduate of that school makes money-wise, and all sorts of other information that is official, but some colleges may not want to publicize it, especially if they don't look particularly good. So I think like these, you know, the ranking, graduation rate, and then the salary and the employment rate should be the things to look for. And again, if you got into Harvard, this is like no-brainer, all of these things are good. But if you got into some college where maybe you are not quite sure, I mean, checking these things are very important. Now, additionally, I just won't say too much on that, but these other included here resources, I think are also quite good because, for example, Niche has reviews from current students. You register these websites, but it's free, you don't have to pay money. And again, you can get a lot of information about college. They rank them, like what is the food like, what's the party scene like, what are the professors like. So there is some kind of official information and some information from students, which I think is also quite helpful. Keeping in mind that oftentimes people who post reviews, maybe people who are either particularly happy or particularly unhappy with their school, but still like reading 30, 40 reviews, you can get a sense. Like if everybody is mentioning that, say, I don't know, dormitories are really bad, like that might be good to know, right? And then also don't feel at all shy if you're already seriously looking at a couple of schools to email admission offices. People who work there, it's their job to get people in college. So they answer questions, they provide resources. So you, by all means, you know, don't feel like if you write that email that nobody will ever answer, people will answer and they'll answer your questions. So certainly contacting admission offices with questions is a very good idea, right? Okay, so let me talk now about the application process here. It's a little bit jump here, right? Now, another important difference with Ukrainian system, that when you apply into college or university, you are not usually, not always, but usually, as an undergraduate, you are not applying to any specialization, like na fakultet, na kafedru, like for particular department. You are just applying to college. Because the idea is in America that colleges don't usually expect 18-year-olds to know what they want to study, right? Like in Ukraine, you would be applying to Department of Economics or, you know, foreign languages like I did when I was undergraduate student in Ukraine, or maybe physics or what have you. In America, that's usually not the case. You are just applying to college. Yes, you will indicate in your letter that you are interested in studying physics or you're interested in studying history, but you are not required to study that subject. You can change your mind. And what happens after 2 years of study, usually at the end of the sophomore year, the years are called, first year is called freshman year, second year is called sophomore year, third year is junior year, and fourth year is senior year. So American students decide what their specialty will be. So they do what's called declare major at the end of the second year. So you have 2 years to kind of take different classes, explore your interests, and maybe you will continue studying what you thought you would when you applied. I mean, many of my students that I advise at Taft, they come in, they say, we want to study political science, like I liked it in school, and they continue with political science. But I certainly had people who came in thinking they want to study political science, and then they took a class in biology and they loved it. And they decided to switch to biology, or the other way around. So American system gives you this flexibility, which I think is very nice. Because, you know, I don't know about all of you guys, but I have a 17-year-old who has very little idea what she wants to do. So for her, like, going to a college and then deciding is actually a good thing, right? Now, certainly there are places and colleges where students are more specialized. If, say, you want to study art, you can go to dedicated art school. Again, you would have kind of like a choice between different types of art you can study, but you can't really switch to study physics without changing school, simply because art schools don't offer, you know, majors in physics. And again, there are some colleges that have the specialty, like Massachusetts Institute of Technology has all sorts of different topics, but it is known for sciences, for computer science, for math, for hard sciences. So oftentimes people who would go there, they want to study these subjects, right? Even though you can study literature and history and so forth at MIT as well. So just to kind of keep in mind, it's a big difference that you are not applying necessarily to specific department, you're applying to university in general. Now, application cycle for American, for if you want to start in September, the application cycle starts in this fall, in autumn, year before, so almost a year before. So now is actually, if you are considering, you know, going to American university, for example, as a transfer student, and starting next September. So for this September, it's way too late. So for next September, this is really very good time to start and start thinking about all of these things. So what does the application process really look like? So I included here again this links to this guide. It's actually local high school put it together. It is very, very comprehensive. I was using it myself for my daughter who will be applying next year. And there are things I learned there I didn't know. So I certainly encourage you. It's a Google Doc. It seems to be open access. You don't have to be a member of that high school to read it. So I certainly recommend reading that. And then there was another one I included. But basically, these are the requirements. So you have to have, obviously, your grades, your transcript. So that's something you would be requesting from your school or from university records. Letters of recommendation from your teachers, very important. I don't know, and here, you know, the teachers here, write the letters yourself. Don't tell students to write them and that you will sign them. I remember asking for a letter of recommendation when I was applying, you know, back in the 1990s, and my professor at Kyiv State University, she's like, oh yeah, вы напишите, я подпишу. Like, don't do that to your students. These letters are hugely important. And you want the letter to show something specific to the student, right? Like you want the letter, I read a lot of these letters and I wrote a lot of these letters to my students. And the ones that really stand out to you, that kind of show you something individual, unique about the student, not just that they, you know, went to classes, did their homework, were a good participant, but something specific. They wrote particularly insightful paper. They maybe, you know, during class discussion really impressed you with the depth of their understanding or the kind of questions or comments that they asked, right? Of course, if students won any awards or participated in any Olympiads and things like this, that's worth mentioning too. But I would, like, you know, re-emphasize both, you know, the students, when you ask for letters, ask professors who you feel know you well, who can say something specific and unique about you. And professors, when you are asked to write these letters, really, you know, try to like not have student do it, but do it yourself. And again, these letters, of course, are meant to be confidential. Now, so certainly all of these things, I'm happy to answer questions after we finish. The proof of English proficiency, for most people, it is TOEFL. Sometimes, again, you can look at what your university accepts. Sometimes they accept as a score. Sometimes they might say if you maybe was an exchange student at some point and you did say a year at an American or English-speaking university, they might accept that as sufficient proof, but that's pretty straightforward. Now, the essays, that is also something that in this common application, so I linked it here. This is the application form for all colleges or almost all colleges in America. When you apply, you have to fill in this thing called Common App. So it is here, linked here. I think this application Common App for next fall is going to be released August 1st. So you can just go to the website, create account, it's free. And then you can see what are the questions for essays for a given year. Sometimes they repeat, sometimes they're a little bit different, but they're really about your personal, like your personality, I would say. It is not, the questions are not about tell me, you know, why you're interested in sociology. The questions would be like, tell me about a challenge that you experienced in your life and how you overcame it. Tell me about, you know, if you rethought some ideas, some beliefs that you had, and then you changed your mind, like how did that happen, right? So the questions are really trying to get at some unique, again, personality, sets of beliefs, what kind of person you are. So all of these other things, how good a student you are, what classes you took, you know, what activities you did, all of these things are in different parts of the application. So for the essay, it is really a glimpse into you as a person, as a personality. So that's also something good to keep in mind. There is a lot of useful advice on the internet about writing personal essay. If you go to these guides in the Newton High School guide and that other guide, there are tips there for essay writing. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, right? Now, the standardized tests, this actually has changed in recent years because before this test, it's either SAT or ACT. They are similar. There is some, most students, undergraduate students take SAT test, ACT is another option. I'm not even sure what the difference is. I think ACT may have a science section and SAT just has English and math. But basically it's standardized test. You know, you register and you know, it's 2-hour test to take. Before, pretty much all colleges required these tests, and you can easily check if you go to these previous websites, either Niche or College Scorecard, you can see what was the average score for admitted students. That's actually helpful information because obviously the better the college, the more selective they are, and the higher the average score would be, right? So if you say do have an SAT score, if you are going to take an SAT score, and you apply into a school that requires SAT, you can estimate your chances of getting in depending on your score, right? So if, say, the average score at Harvard, I think is probably over 1,500. I think the maximum was like 1,600 or something, right? So if you received 1,100, like that's probably not a school, you know, where you realistically can get in, right? But there are some schools where, you know, maybe like 900 isn't admitted, like at an average. And that's probably also a sign that maybe academically the school, or at least the students that go to the school, are not particularly strong because that's a pretty low score. Now, the good thing is that now, and that started with COVID, but it continues now, more and more schools do not require SAT. So they now say that they are what is called test optional. Test optional means that you can send your scores, but you don't have to. And that is definitely something to consider because these tests for foreign students are difficult. So you can be a very good student, but because it's in English, it sort of tests English proficiency of native speakers. So it is actually, you know, it's pretty hard. So unless, again, you are a very good test taker and you think you can ace that score, or you already maybe take the class and you have, take the test and you have a high score, if it says test optional, I would just say, forget it. You know, emphasize your essays, your grades, your kind of unique, you know, contributions you can bring to the school and not so much worry about these SATs. Now, that said, some schools continue to require it. So that could be also a factor when you are selecting, say, places to apply to. Do you want to take this test? Can you take the test? It's in Ukraine, like it's now very difficult. I'm sure there are no testing centers probably in Ukraine. I don't know, maybe you have to go to Poland to take this test, right? So that could become complication. Now, last two things I'll mention, I'll talk about financial thing next slide in greater detail. But these extracurricular activities, community service, things like that, it is another difference between, I would say, Ukrainian and European system more generally and American system. I think if you apply to any university in Ukraine, when you were applying from high school, right, or if you apply from, you know, to Germany, I don't think they really cared like what clubs you were in high school and if you participated in a dance, you know, group or whatever. But in the US, they actually do. They want, you know, to see students who bring these different interests, who have sort of, you know, maybe shown leadership in a school club, right, who did some community service. So all of these things count. Again, this is not what's going to get you in. If you have excellent community service and you were president of 5 clubs, but you have poor grades, like that's not going to get you in college. But if you already have high grades and all of this, and you additionally, you know, did something in this community service in, you know, extracurricular activities, what they call, like that's a plus. So if you do have something, you kind of have to put something on the application form anyway. If you don't have anything particularly impressive, that's okay. But if you do, that is definitely worth emphasizing, right? Maybe you started some business, like that's a great thing to mention, right? Or like even website you run, or a blog, or like a YouTube channel with many subscribers. Like these are the kinds of things that you would mention for this part of the application, extracurricular activities. Now, financial aid. So financial costs, so that's a big deal. So let me talk a little bit about it. There is good news and bad news. The bad news is that education in the US is very expensive. The good news is that there is money to be given, including to foreign students. So as a foreign student, you could get in and get full funding. And especially if you're a good student, there are schools, the top schools, the better the school, the more money they have. So for example, if you get admitted to Harvard, and many, like about at least 10 other top schools do this, they pay full ride. So if you don't have the money, but you're good enough to be admitted, they'll pay every single cent. So in that sense, if you're actually an excellent student, it is better to apply to these really selective schools because they have the money to give, as opposed to apply to some local school that may be cheaper, but $20,000 is still a lot. And they wouldn't have the money to give you, right? No matter how brilliant you are. So if you are really, really good, definitely aim high. Just to give you some sense, these are average numbers. This is like, what was this expression? Like середня температура по лікарні, which I think is kind of meaningless because it's the average in the country, right? So again, it would be very different. I was looking at these numbers and I'm thinking Massachusetts, where I live, which is a state, quite expensive. All our numbers are higher. For public school, for community college, even for private schools, but still good to keep in mind. So what goes into the cost of attending? Tuition and fees is a big piece. So that's basically the money you pay to the university for your education. That's what university uses, to pay professors' salaries, to build buildings, to basically run, right? That's a big part of this tuition. And as you see, right, these smaller schools, the public 2-year community schools, which give these associate's degree I talked about, right? The 2-year degrees, and in some cases also 4-year college degrees. They're the cheapest, but they are really also, they don't have usually any financial aid. And it's really only an option if you have some other way of being in the United States. For example, you have family here that you can stay with, right? And then that may become economical option. You don't have to pay for dormitory. You can live somewhere, with friends or family, and you can attend community college and you just pay the fee, the tuition to attend, which could be as low as $3,000-5,000 a year, right? So that's really quite cheap. That's in that way. But again, it is usually an option for students who have some other way of staying in the country, because as a foreign student, yes, it's only $5,000, but you still have to live somewhere. You have to get a visa. You have to get all this money. So then all of these costs add up right away. And again, as I'm saying, because these are smaller, less prestigious, poorer schools, they don't have money to give to foreign students. So you would not receive financial aid. So unless you can cover the whole cost yourself, that's really probably not an option. Now, the 4-year public schools, right? The difference here is for what it says here, I hope you can see in the slide, in-state, right, and out-of-state. In-state is for students who are residents of the state. As a foreign student, you would not qualify your first year because obviously you're not a resident, you're coming from somewhere else, from abroad, right? So you would be looking at the cost that say out-of-state cost, right? But after the first year, you become in-state because you already lived there. So for the rest of your education, so if say you start as a freshman, the first year you would pay this higher out-of-state fee. But the next year you pay the in-state fee. So that's also something to keep in mind. Say you have some money potential or your family, maybe you can pay for 1 year, but not for more. So then, that might be sort of, a consideration, because as long as you can cover the first year as an out-of-state student, for the second year and third and fourth, your price will be lower because you are in-state, right? Now, again, here it says average cost in the United States for out-of-state is $27,000, but it can really vary. I looked just out of curiosity yesterday at United States, in our state, the UMass system, University of Massachusetts system, which is a public system in the state of Massachusetts, and our flagship university is called University of Massachusetts in Amherst, which is a public school. It's very good, and their price is higher. So here it's like $27,000. I think UMass was like $38,000 for out of state. So it can really vary. But then again, in some other states, it can be cheaper. So this is really the average. And then, the private universities, they're the most expensive. But as I said, they are also the ones with the most money. So don't be like, you look at the fee for Harvard or for Tufts, and it says something like, I don't even know, like $70,000 a year. There are some fantastic numbers, right? But most students don't pay this money, right? So somebody who's very rich and like their family is a millionaire, yeah, they would be asked to pay this money. But for other students who get accepted, they look at your family income. If your family income is low, you can get full ride, meaning every dollar of your attendance is paid by the university because they want you there. But in general, private four-year universities are the most expensive. And in addition to this tuition and fees, right, the dark blue, of course, you have expenses for your living expenses. Room and board basically refers to dormitory and food. Many, not all, but especially private schools and some state schools would require you to live on campus at least for a year, sometimes two. So again, even if, say, you have family in the area or you have some other way, maybe you say, okay, I don't want to live in this expensive dorm, I can find a cheaper apartment. Like that may not be an option, at least for the first year, right? Because they want to build community. So even students who live in the same city, which I think is quite unusual, because, right, if somebody lives in Kharkiv, they're not going to live in the dorm in a Kharkiv university. But in the US, that's the case. Like my child hopes to go to Tufts, because, in that case, for her, actually, it would be free, but that's a different thing because I work at Tufts, so there are these benefits for faculty. And she could live at home, but she won't be able to because Tufts requires that students live for the first 2 years on campus. So I'll have to pay for her room and board, even though she could live in her room at home, right? So that's just not an option. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think from the student perspective, it's actually good because you meet other students, you live together, you study together, you make friends. But of course, if you're looking to save money, and you can maybe have like an uncle in some town where you can go to college, but the college says, no, if you go here, you have to live on campus the first year, add that to your cost, right? Now, transportation, if you live on campus, is not, obviously, you don't have to pay probably anything because you can walk or bicycle to most places. But if you are a commuter student, so if, say, you do have some family or relatives in the US and you live with them, but then you commute to college, right, you add up transportation expenses. Books and supplies, the obvious thing, and then incidentals, say, like when college closes for the winter break, like where do you go, right? You have to live somewhere if you want to go back home, right, or stay with somebody. So there are all of these like vacation expenses. So all of these things together, let me actually put this, I'm going to talk about this now. It's called something the cost of attendance. At the end here, right, it says the cost of attendance. And again, that can vary, right, depending if, say, your tuition, as I was saying, the first year you're paying out-of-state tuition if you go to state school, but second and third and fourth year you're paying in-state tuition, so the cost of attendance drops, right? If you have transportation costs, so if you don't, so these things kind of like can vary. But let's talk about how to actually get money, because presumably most people who apply from Ukraine are not independently wealthy, although of course if your parents are oligarchs, congratulations to you and they can pay for your education, but for most other people they try to get some financial support, right? So as I was saying, very important, this idea that like if it's an expensive university, you cannot afford it, you do not apply. That's wrong. Like that's actually the opposite. So if you are a strong student, I can't emphasize it highly enough, aim high. Apply to Harvard, apply to Princeton, apply to Tufts, apply to Yale, apply to all of these top schools because they all have money to give. And how do you know this? You would look at if the college says that they have something called need blind admission, meaning they make the admission decisions without looking at your financial situation. So you apply for financial aid, but these are two separate processes, right? So they say we have enough money to admit the best students that we want. And then if they don't have money, we will pay for the education, right? That's your need blind admission. So that's very important. And other colleges, which is very similar, this is what my university, Tufts, does. They say they meet 100% of your estimated need. What does it mean? It means that they're going to look at your financial application. They are going to determine, and I'll talk briefly about how colleges determine it, what they think you can pay based on your income and your parents' income. And this estimated family contribution could literally be zero. When I applied, my father was a physicist in Ukraine. It was like early 1990s. I think his salary in American terms at the time, like in dollars, was something like $20 a month. So I filled in all these forms, but my estimated family contribution was zero because nobody had any money, right? So, and then, Harvard, I did my PhD at Harvard. They paid every dollar. I didn't pay a single cent for my education, right? Because, my estimated family contribution was zero. Now, if your family happens to be a little bit better off and maybe they do have some money, they may calculate that you owe the college $1,000 a year. That may be your estimated financial contribution, right? It's still some money, but they think that's what you can afford. And then if it meets 100% of your estimated need, it means the difference between the cost of attendance here, right? Whatever, all of these things that you have to pay and your estimated family contribution is what university will pay you. So they will give you scholarships, some kind of combination of grants. They might offer you loans. That's unusual. Usually foreign students don't get loans. I'll say a word about loans. You have to be careful when it comes to the loans. But this difference between cost of attendance, estimated financial contribution is the money that school has to offer. And again, I'll want to re-emphasize this point. Good, rich universities, expensive universities have the money. So they're the ones that's important, to keep in mind, and don't rule them out because it costs 100,000 a year, because they have this money to give you if they want to admit you, right? Now, how can you get a sense of what sort of money they might be expected you to pay? I included these two things here. The FAFSA estimator, this FAFSA stands for something free federal assistance to students or something like this. This is US government run website. And basically it is used for families to estimate if they're eligible for federal, for government financial aid. You as a non-citizen will not be eligible for this aid, for the actual aid. But the tool is used by all colleges and universities because it basically, it's like a math formula. So you put in information, what is your salary, how much your apartment costs, is there a mortgage, how much your father makes, how much your mother makes, right? Do they have a business? All of these questions, right? And then it gives you okay, your estimated family contribution would be around $2,000, $0, $40,000, right? Based on the numbers that you put in. And that's what colleges use. So even though you cannot use this form to actually get US government money for your study because you're non-citizens, you can use the form to get a good sense of what it is that colleges would expect you to pay, if anything, right? And that tool is free, and I definitely encourage you to just especially if you have any assets, if you work or if your parents have good jobs, you have some assets. If you have almost nothing, if you have your stipend and your parents are making $100 a month, probably it will be zero, right? But if anybody with any kind of assets, and by assets they literally mean things such as property, cars, boats, things like that. Now, in addition to FAFSA, so all schools use FAFSA to get a sense of what families should pay. These private, richer, more prestigious schools use, in addition, this other thing called SSC profile, and that is kind of more in-depth look at the financing. So my advice to you, again, only if your family has some assets, right, to try to do both and sort of see what number it gives you, because usually for American students, the SSC profile, because it takes into account more sources of wealth. For example, if your family has a retirement fund, say your parents work, right, and they save some money for the retirement, the SSC profile would want to know how much money they saved, because they may expect some percentage of this retirement money. It's usually a small percent, around 5%, to be paid towards the child's education. FAFSA doesn't look at retirement at all. So you could have saved, your family could have saved $1 million for retirement. As long as it's a retirement money, they don't look into that. The SSC profile does. So they kind of want to extract, in some sense, more money, right? So they want to say okay, we really want to know what your wealth is, and only if you really don't need the money, we will give it to you. So, but it's kind of, I think useful to do this to get a sense of what it is your estimated family contribution might be, if anything, right? And this guide I linked another thing which explains all of what I just said in greater detail. So you can certainly take your time, read through it, and try to understand this, right? So that's, again, I'm happy to answer questions, but the main rule, kind of get it into your head that expensive, rich, prestigious universities are the ones that have the money, and the ones you have higher chances of getting financial aid from if you are a strong student, right? So don't just rule them out because they're so expensive, because you can go there for free, literally for free. Right, okay. So I'll just say very few words about loans. I never used loans. Foreign students, it is difficult for foreign students to get loans. Sometimes university might offer you. So if you got into one of these rich universities, I actually had a Bulgarian friend in graduate school, and she attended this college. It's all girls college called Mount Holyoke. Very good, by the way. If you're women in the audience, consider don't rule out these all girls schools, because obviously you can still meet boys, and there are events and all of this. But many of these all women colleges are very prestigious, very high level of education. There is a network of them, I think, called Seven Sisters. So you might want to Google. I don't think I put it in the slide, Seven Sisters, but it's a group of colleges in the northeast of the United States. Excellent education. And they, as I was saying, my Bulgarian friend, so she received pretty much full ride. They covered all her expenses, and they gave her a small loan. So part of her financial aid package was a loan from college. It wasn't like a bank loan. It was the college money that they lent her. And then she repaid it over the course of 10 years after she graduated. It was maybe like $5,000 they gave her or something like that. So it wasn't like the main, but it was part of the package. Now, what is available to foreign students are these loans, sometimes from these various banks. So this is the table that was put together by University of Massachusetts in Amherst, which is the flagship, as I said, like the main state university in Massachusetts, and they admit a lot of foreign students. They give them some financial aid, and they also indicate on their website that if you're a foreign student, you could look into these loans. They all require a co-signer, so that makes it very difficult. You basically would need to know somebody in the United States who is either a citizen or green card holder who will co-sign on the loan with you. Because banks are worried that, foreign students finish studies, they leave the country, they never get their money back, so somebody else would then have to pay. So I would say this is usually not a good option for foreign students just because it's really unrealistic. But if you do happen to have a rich uncle in the United States, who can co-sign on the loan with you, there are some possibilities for the loans there. But I won't say much about the loans because, the student debt, it could be terrible. People could be greatly in debt, especially if they end up borrowing money. Some American families end up like this. They borrow money for the universities with low graduation rate, with not very good job prospects. They end up owning, tens of thousands of dollars, and then the students cannot get good paying jobs, and that's really a burden. So I would say loans in general, I think, should be avoided as much as possible. And as foreign student, you don't even have many options, right? Again, because you need a co-signer, US citizen or resident, but there's just some information, right? If that happens to be applicable to you, you can look up these, links and see what they have to offer, right? Now, so let me now talk about graduate degrees, and then we can, do question and answer just to make sure there is time for all sorts of questions that you might have. So again, as I was saying, master's degree and PhD degree, you do not need to have a master's degree. First, you can apply for PhD degree directly after you receiving your undergraduate degree, your bachelor's degree. That is, if you are really interested in more in-depth study at the graduate level, I would say it's a better option, exactly because it is then would usually be free, because PhD programs are usually fully funded. If they're not fully funded, that's already a sign that's not a very good program. So you really should be looking, at programs that offer full funding. And then in the course of studying for PhD, you actually get your master's degree. After the first 2 years of study, you end up with a master's degree anyway, right? So as I said, these master's degrees are built into PhD program. Now, sometimes it happens. This is not, if you're even considering this, definitely don't mention this in the application. But theoretically speaking, think about it, right? Like say you only want to study for master's program, but master's programs usually don't have money, they're expensive. Like, how do you get just master's? Some people apply for PhD program and they don't really intend to finish PhD program, right? They intend to actually get a master's after 2 years and then they can leave. There is no rule against it. If you say that on your application, of course, no PhD program would admit you because they want to admit people who want to do research and continue in the PhD. But for whatever reason, either because it was your plan to begin with, or maybe you wanted to do a PhD, but after 2 years of study, you realized, that's not for me. I don't see myself for the next 3, 4, 5 years researching some topic, sitting in the library. I really want to get out into the world. I want to get a job. Then you can walk away. Is after you took your PhD exams, after 2 years, you can get your master's degree and walk away, right? And you got your master's essentially paid for, right? So I'll get to that too. Let me just let me talk a little bit that third point here, that you don't have to apply to a graduate degree in the same field where you do your undergraduate studies. That is also something I think different from the Ukrainian system, right? Because if you received your bachelor's degree in history, right, can you really then go and study sociology? Like, I don't know, when I was a student, I don't think it was possible. I remember receiving what they called like направлення в аспірантуру, and my направлення was for like foreign philology, because that's what I did as an undergraduate degree. I did not want to study linguistics. Any of you linguists in the audience, more power to you, but I decided does not interest me. I wanted to study politics. In Ukraine at the time, it was not an option. But in the US it is. So you can apply to a PhD program in a different discipline. Now, you do have to have some background. And again, for American students, they, because even when they declared major in, say, biology, they still took some number of classes in political science, some number of classes in history, right? Some number of math classes. So they can say that they have background in these other fields. but certainly within social sciences, right? If your undergraduate degree is in history, but you really want to study sociology, that's sort of close enough, and the other way around, right? And again, you would need to explain in your application, so what is the background that you have to study history at the graduate level. But if you've taken some classes, or if you did the sort of sociological research on historical topics, right, even though your degree is in sociology, you can still apply for PhD in history and the other way around, right? So that's also something to keep in mind. Whatever it is that you are studying, you are not limited to graduate program just in that same discipline. You have a little bit broader range of related disciplines you can apply for, right? So the funding, as I was saying, kind of as a rule of thumb, there is money for PhD programs. There is much less money to master's programs. There are some funding for master's programs. I linked this resource. So this website called Profello, I don't know, they have these tips. It's called 5 Reasons Why You Should Not Pay for Graduate School Out of Pocket. So again, it seems like you can create a free account and they send you some list of various scholarships that may exist for master's degree. Sometimes, and that's kind of usually what happens, that university would advertise itself, that if, say, they have master's program and that has, they admit maybe 30 students, and of these students, the top 5 would receive funding, right? So Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, where I have an affiliation, as Professor Legeda mentioned, they have a master's program in regional, it's called like Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies. So they admit about maybe 20 or so people into this program, and I think they have about 5 full scholarships. So there are programs like this, but they are not very common. So usually for master's programs, people get some sort of combination of loans. If, say, it's a law school is very expensive, but then lawyers get a lot of money, right? So that's another thing. So the expectation is if you're applying for a master's program, you are going to be professionally employed in 2 years, and you should be able to make enough money to pay for your education. For many students, it's the case. It is not always the case. So again, just sort of that's kind of the trick with the master's programs, that funding is much harder to get. Now, for PhD programs, it's a completely different story. PhD programs are usually fully funded, which means what? Which means university would cover your tuition costs, so you don't have to pay tuition. And for your living expenses, you either receive a stipend, so some amount of money. I think it is now maybe like around $20,000 a year, give or take. Again, might depend on the school, that they would give you as a scholarship, as a stipend for your living expenses, and or some combination of a stipend and teaching assistantship. So teaching assistantship means that you work as a teaching assistant in the courses that professors teach. So you would be helping with grading, meeting with students, things like this. And again, you get paid for this, and that's the money that you would live on. So essentially all good or at least half decent PhD programs are offering full funding. I would say stay away from PhD programs that don't offer funding or don't offer full funding. That's a sign by itself that this is not a very good program, because, you know, again, this is very uncommon. You know, it's kind of a sign that something is like, you know, the program is probably not that great if they're not offering full funding. And most, not just, again, here it's a difference. It's not just Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all these fancy, expensive schools. State schools offer full funding. So there are very good state universities in every state. I'll here have in a minute. Yeah. And they actually want to admit Ukrainian students, but very few students are applying, maybe because they don't know, maybe because application process is hard. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who teaches at University of Wisconsin in Madison, state school, very, very good. They have a PhD program in political science. And she said they had like a ton of applications from Russians and very few actually no from Ukrainians. And she said they kind of felt sad because they wanted to, you know, admit more Ukrainians, but people are not applying, maybe because, you know, it's not known. So maybe Professor Legeda was going to say that she was willing, this colleague of mine, to talk to your students maybe as a panel or to other students in September. We can talk about it later on, but that might be a good idea if this, you know, because many universities are now online, if maybe, you know, not just your university, but some other universities could create an event. And then she said she could organize some fellow professors who serve on the admission committees. Like I don't do this because my university actually does not afford PhDs in political science. So we only work with undergraduate students in political science. But certainly I have many, many colleagues, and they would be willing to do sort of presentation about application process for PhD programs in political science, social sciences in the fall. So that's something, if that's of interest, and you have colleagues at other universities to do some kind of group, Zoom like this, we can talk about it later, right? Now, so let me kind of wrap up with talking a little bit more specifically, again, since I'm a political scientist, this is what I know best. So let me talk a little bit more specifically, kind of do's and don'ts when you apply to political science and some social studies PhD program in general, right? I already mentioned that your undergraduate degree does not have to be in the same discipline, so something to keep in mind, right? What does the application require? So these are the typical requirements for PhD program. The scores from the graduate record examination test. This is similar to SAT, but at a more advanced level. It's basically a standardized test for, graduate study. It also has a section on math, a section on English. I remember taking it. My score was terrible, and I still got into Harvard. I mean, by terrible, I mean I got like 55%, like not very good, right? Like not 70% or whatever. But I still got into Harvard. Like, why is that? Because this is just one of the things that the school looks at. They know that foreign students find this examination very hard. If you have a great GRE score, that's great. But if you have a mediocre GRE score, it is probably not going to kill your chances if other parts of your application are strong, right? So for example, like my English score in the GRE was pretty low because the test is really hard. But I had very good TOEFL test score, right? So they say like, okay, so she clearly knows English, GRE is hard, like we are not gonna weight it, too heavily. There may be some cases, some schools might say you have to get a certain minimum on the GRE score. That's a helpful information because if say you need to have X number of points on math and you got half that, don't waste time applying to that school, right? If they're saying they want students who receive at least a certain, number of points, and you don't have that, just like move on to the next, right? But many schools look at it what they call like more holistically, meaning that they look at the whole package and they would not disqualify a student just because they had low GRE. But, that said, if you have higher, of course, that's better. So something worth kind of keeping in mind and potentially studying ahead for, right? English proficiency test, again, usually TOEFL. There are some other options. Undergraduate transcript, these are your grades from your undergraduate degree. Obviously, the higher the grades, the better your chances. Again, it is not everything. You have a few B's here and there, that's okay. But generally, they're looking at like, really high scores, right? Now, these letters of recommendation, again, very important. And if you're applying for a PhD program, these letters of recommendation should say something about your research skills, right? So ask professors with whom you have written, referat, kursova robota, diploma, something that they can comment on you as a scholar, right? Well, how did you go about research? How did you analyze the literature? How did you collect the data? What conclusions you drew, right? Like, did you produce some impressive piece of writing? So that's something that they definitely are interested in hearing, right? And also the writing sample. So the writing sample is basically some paper, could be, kursova robota, could be something, maybe you wrote an article or some sort of like working paper or something, right? But they want a writing sample of 15 to 25 pages that shows your capacity to do academic level writing, right? So again, if you have particularly good paper you wrote in Ukrainian, have it translated in English, right? And that could be your writing sample. So that's also something important. Now, the last but not least is the statement of purpose, where basically is a letter where you explain why you want to study in the graduate program and what is it that you want to study. That is very important because this is what gives the admissions committee indication. First of all, like if they're admitting an incoming class, they don't want to admit, say they admit 20 students. They don't want to admit 20 students who all want to study US Congress, right? They also don't want to admit 20 students who all want to study Mexico. They want to have some sort of variety of, topics and interests that students will bring. And that's something you have to convey in your letter. What is it that you want to study? What do you already know? What kind of questions you want to pursue, right? Like why you think that's important? What's your background? Like, are you qualified to study what you're saying that you will study? Now, it is different. Say, when I was applying for PhD programs, I thought that the statement of purpose, you basically have to have like a topic of your dissertation specified. It is not. It is different in the UK. For example, in the UK, when you apply for PhD program, they call like you are reading for your PhD. And you really are just working on your dissertation. There is no class, there are no classes anymore, or very few classes. So they admit you on the basis of how well developed your planned topic for your PhD dissertation is, right? Like, I want to study civil society in Ukraine during Euromaidan. Okay, that's a topic. You would show in your application what already been studied, that you know the literature, that you found some interesting question that nobody really looked at, or if there is some debate in the literature about it, and you want to contribute this way, right? In the US, the statement of purpose is broader. It does not have to be focused on one specific topic. But you do have to indicate, generally speaking, what is it that you're interested in? Are you interested in causes of interstate wars, right? And you want to study why countries, there are wars between countries and sometimes there is peace, right? Like that's a topic, right? You want to study, say, civil society in Eastern Europe. That's also a topic, right? Maybe you'll study Ukraine, maybe you'll compare Ukraine with Poland. Maybe you will look at historical period, say perestroika and around, maybe you will look at it now, right? Again, you can sort of indicate your interests. Like if you say, okay, in general, I'm interested in civil society, and these are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in pursuing, right? You don't have to commit to one specific question because you will take 2 years of classes before you start writing your PhD in the US. And that gives you a chance to change your mind, to refine your topics, right? To become more, to do something else. So, there's 2 years you take classes before you get to writing your PhD dissertation, which is different in Europe, because in Europe, once you're admitted, at least in the UK, once you are admitted to PhD program, you right away start writing your dissertation. So you have to have a clearly defined topic for PhD dissertation, not the case in the US, right? So if you have this general interest in whatever it may be, like that could be sufficient for the purposes of application, but you have to make it clear. So when they read your application, right, all these faculty members, and they're like, okay, so here is, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, like they teach about political parties. Is the student going to work with them? No, because the student says they're interested in nationalism. And in our department, nationalism is these other professors who teach, right? Like, okay, who else do we have applying who wants to study nationalism? How are their applications different? Which one of them is better, right? So you have to have admission committee kind of clear sense what it is you want to study for your PhD, right? What topic, set of topics, what you already know, right? So that's a very good approach to say, like, I have written, kursova robota or my senior thesis or diploma on this and this topic. I found it very interesting, but I want to take it further. And these are the questions that I didn't get to look at, but emerged as important based on my earlier research. This is the kind of stuff that goes in your application, right? Now, just last thing to wrap up, a few do's and don'ts, generally speaking, and then I can take all the questions. Let me put all of this up and then we will talk about it, right? Now, again, cannot emphasize it enough. Aim high. If you are a strong student, right, you have good record, apply to the best universities, highly ranked. This is where you have high chance of getting full funding, right? And then all good things come with it. So you have more time for your research, you produce better research, you have better chance to get a better job, make more money, all of these things, right? So definitely aiming high. Now, not just private schools. So for undergraduate degree, it is much easier for bachelor's degree to get funding at private schools because state schools usually don't have much or don't have any funding for foreign students. That's not the case for graduate program because for PhD programs, state schools also offer foreign students full financial aid for PhD program, right? Again, not every single state university in the United States, but all good ones do. So if you look at a flagship university, which means like the main state university in any state, if they have a PhD program in your field, chances are they will have full support, financial support for that as well for foreign students, right? This Big Ten, just as an example, for example, this is Big Ten colleges. These are big state schools in the Midwest, in the middle of, Wisconsin, Indiana, all these places. They have, again, full funding. It's a consortium. So I was just saying, if you Google it, you can see what universities are included. So if you are considering PhD programs and you don't mind living in the Midwest, it's anything from big cities such as Chicago to smaller towns in Iowa. But these are main state universities. They all have full funding for PhD programs. So that's, something to keep in mind, right? Now, this last few things, just very briefly. Researching faculty at a university where you're thinking is applying is not a bad idea. Why is that? Because you want to study at a department where whatever it is that you want to study, there is somebody you can work with, right? So if, say, you want to study, federalism in Latin America, right? But there is nobody in the department who works on this, or even on related topics, right? So when you send in your application, they can immediately say, look, this student wants to study the kinds of things that we don't really teach because we don't have faculty teaching this. We are probably not a good fit for the student, even if you are a very strong student, right? So if you can, usually, again, if you're set of topics you're interested in are indicated broadly, probably there is faculty teaching it and your focus can change and new faculty can get hired and sometimes faculty leaves. So this is not all about it. But if you say looked at the list of professors teaching in the department and you see like here is somebody whose research is very similar or like very close to what I want to do, that is worth mentioning in the application. Don't make it artificial. Like if you didn't find anybody, you know, in the list who seems like very close to interest, don't bother, because if you kind of indicate somebody and the connection is not there, they can easily say, the student is just doing it to show off or whatever, right? But if it's really a good connection, then it's worth indicating it, because, you know, that professor may be on the faculty and they may look at your application and they say, oh yeah, like that's interesting. Like I actually see myself working with a student, right? So do a little bit of research. It is not necessary for undergraduate degree. Don't even bother doing this when you're applying for bachelor's degree as a transfer student. But if you're applying for PhD program, it does make sense to research the faculty. And, you know, if you see a connection with your research, intellectual interests, and that faculty, to indicate that in the application, right? Now, another point, very important, the last 2 points, right? Play to your strengths and don't propose to study something you know nothing about. Again, advice comes from my friend and colleague who was on admissions committee at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She says, we get students from foreign countries who would say, like, you know, that's how they're thinking, right? Like if I come from France and I say I want to study French politics, they probably won't admit me because they want me to study something different. So why don't I say I'm going to study Brazil, right? Well, that's great, except for if you have never studied Brazil, if you don't know the language, that is not going to make you more appealing. It's going to make you less appealing, right? So in other words, play to your strengths. It is totally fine. If, say, you come from Ukraine, right? You know Ukrainian language, you know Russian language, you want to study this region, and that's really what you want to do, say that. It only makes you a stronger candidate. You already have required language skills. You have some sort of knowledge of the region, right? So definitely play to your strengths. If you want to study Brazil, that's great. But you have to have some sort of background in this, right? You have to have the required language skill. You have to sort of, whatever you say you propose to study, your previous background has to convince the committee that you have necessary preparation, right? It is often language skills. If, say, you want to study something highly statistical, right, that would be, you know, that you have statistical skills, right? If you want to do large N analyses of causes of war in the world, right? Do you have the statistical background, right? And also, I think it's important to indicate, also advice from my friend who reads these applications, the willingness to learn and an open mind, right? You may want to say, like, look, I didn't have opportunity to take many classes in, you know, statistical analysis, but I'm actually really interested in learning. And when I'm in graduate school, I want to take some classes in statistics and then potentially, you know, use the statistics in my dissertation research in such and such a way. So that's also great, because even though you don't yet have the skills, you know what skills you need and you're showing that you're willing to learn. The same can be applied for languages. Say, like, you want to study, say, a comparison of civil society in Poland and Ukraine, and you know Ukrainian and you know Ukrainian civil society, and you have some good reasons to think why comparison with Poland will be interesting, but you don't know Polish yet, but you say that you are willing to learn Polish, right, to do this comparison well. So that's the kind of thing let's keep in mind. Now, last thing, and I'll end here. The subfield of political science, also very important. Why that is important? Because I think there is a lot of confusion on the part of not just foreign students, but sometimes even American students, between these last two, comparative politics, international relations. And students, especially from Eastern Europe, who really want to study what topic-wise falls under comparative politics, say in the application they want to study international relations, and their applications are read by wrong faculty members and literally thrown away as irrelevant. And if they said they want to study comparative politics, they may well have gotten in. Also, point of advice from my friend who read this application. So let me say a few words about this, and then I'll end and we can talk about, you know, Q&A. So what are the subfields of comparative, of American political science? And basically that's important. It's not important for undergraduate degree because you're just applying to university. But when you're applying for graduate school, you have to say, I want to study X, right? And based on what you say, they also ask you to indicate, it's usually on the application form, which of the subfields of political science your research interests fall under. And if you click the wrong box, right, your applications get routed to that faculty. And that faculty would say, why are we looking at this application? This is not international relations, like irrelevant, right? So very important to put your application in the hands of the right group of people. So let me say a few words about these subfields, and especially the difference between comparative and IR, because that's where a lot of confusion comes in. So American politics is basically the study of domestic politics in the US. So anything from Congress, American political parties, American judiciary. So that's what American politics studies. So if you want to study, you know, different presidents and what they did and why, you are in American politics. Political theory is basically political philosophy. So it's reading of all the thinkers, you know, Nietzsche, Machiavelli, you know, Kant, all of this kind of interpreting historical political thought. If that's your interest, you are in political theory, right? That's the subfield of political science. Some departments, not all departments, but sometimes they now have this sort of separate subfield of quantitative methods. All students now are expected to get trained in quantitative methods. So if you go do political science in the US, you will be required to take some quantitative methods, statistical classes. But if you're already sort of statistical whiz and you're really interested in applying statistical methods, formal methods to the study of politics, you know, you can indicate that on the application. It is in some departments a separate subfield, not always, but sometimes now. Now, the last two, comparative politics, international relations, what's the difference? Basically, comparative politics is a study of domestic politics in foreign countries, right? So all things such as democracy, you know, in the world or in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine, political parties, civil society, the oligarchs, nationalism, identity, all of these things fall under comparative politics, right? So if this is your interest, even though it's like foreign country, you want to know like why is civil society stronger in Ukraine and so weak in Russia? That's the question in comparative politics, right? Even though both countries are foreign and international from the US perspective. So what is international relations? International relations is basically about interstate relations on the international arena. And it is usually much more quantitative. It is now kind of like large N studies of things such as causes of war. People collect databases of all civil wars since, I don't know, the last 100 years. And they run statistical models to say like, what features of countries make them more likely to have civil wars, right? International trade, things like, you know, regulations for international trade, so forth, right? International institutions, like what does UN do, like OSCE, all of these organizations, right? That's the study of the IR. And that's sort of, you see a difference here. So what my friend is saying sometimes happens, that they get applications when people would say like, I want to study, you know, nationalism in Eastern Europe. And yes, it's international relations. Like it isn't international relations. So if international relations faculty looked at this application, they will be like, irrelevant, you know, next, right? But if comparative politics faculty looked at this application, they'll be like, oh yeah, that's, you know, let's look at it closely because this is exactly what we do, right? Now, in an ideal world, responsible international relations professor looking at this application would say, actually, I'm going to send it next door to my colleague in comparative, but they're all overwhelmed. They get hundreds of applications. You don't want to sort of rely on the goodwill of some individual guy for whom it's much easier to just say irrelevant, let's move on and get through the next 60, instead of saying, oh, the student probably didn't misunderstand, let's put the application in a different pile, right? So again, happy to answer more questions, but that's basically, you know, this international relations, comparative politics difference is big, important thing. That's it. So I'm going to end here, and any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Shevell. Thank you so much for such an amazing, such an informative and thought-provoking lecture, so useful for all of us. I'm sure this video will be watched and rewatched for many times. Thank you very much for making it so step-by-step and so clear, and such a fascinating insight into the scheme and into the way that our students might follow. Definitely many of them were not aware of some of the intricacies.
Yeah, and as I was saying, Professor Legate, I can send you the slides so, you know, you can share with the students,
I will
because
happily,
they can use the clickable links. Yeah.
With your permission, I will happily forward it to all the faculties, to all the schools of Vasilka Razin Kharkiv National University. Thank you so much. We have some of the deans present. We have the Dean of Sociology School of Vasilka Razin, Professor Muradan, with us today. I will be happy to provide all the necessary links to Elena Sergeyevna. Dear audience, probably you might have some questions, or just you would wish to express the words of gratitude to our dear guest. You are mostly welcome.
Let's do questions. Forget the words of gratitude. That's
Professor Muradan, the head of the Dean of Sociology School, Vasilka Razin Kharkiv National University. You're so welcome. Dear Elena Sergeyevna, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, especially
Thank you.
because you mentioned me. It was really my honor to see Professor Oksana on the ASN conference, the panel, and once more, it was absolutely great presentation. Thank you for this, especially for the slide, what to do and what you shouldn't do as a future application for PhD studies. As for me, I will recommend it to everyone. It's absolutely very great impact for those who will consider this. And my question, especially thank you for focus for social science, because it's quite interesting. Yes, we know the problem that's, maybe this is actually the answer on your questions, why we don't have so many applications for high ranked school like Harvard, etc. Probably because, as we know, males applicants, many students are not eligible to go abroad because for the ban of mobilization. Me personally, I know a few of those who probably have desire to do that, but it's for them it's impossible for now, but it's just a matter of time, as I think. It's some kind of maybe question is, you said that, yeah, it's quite better to to apply for the study that's for the field that you're familiar with. Yeah, we talk about Ukraine, for example. But what do you think? What is your experience? Isn't there enough application for PhD program, successful application? Is there still interest to this topic for the next year, for example, or just as I know, as I saw so many Ukrainians, BMA and PhD level, I brought now, and also they applied for different American universities. So what do you think? Is it still relevant to propose to our students to send their application with the topic connected exactly to the Ukrainian society?
I would say definitely, because now it's actually more interest, I think, you know, because of this tragedy, right, or because of the Russia's invasion. Ukraine is sort of in the news, like people are interested. I think also people want to help. So that's, you know, as my colleague was saying, when they were looking at these applications, like I think they genuinely wanted to admit Ukrainian students. And I think if they got some, maybe even like it wouldn't be a perfect record, but it was like good enough. And I think, you know, there is a higher chance now to be admitted than before. What I would say, it's so this sort of like, what is the popular topic? I think it's a little bit, how to say it, like, I think people think there are such things as like fashionable topics, but I think it's a little bit more complicated. Let me explain what I mean, right? They want, you know, as at the level of a PhD program, right? It is not just about the country or region, but about the sets of questions, right? And these questions, many of them could be that are relevant like always, right? Like why some countries have strong civil society and some don't, right? Like that is an important question that does not depend on the time in a way, right? Like it's always important. So in a way, if a student wants to study this question in Ukraine, all the more interesting, right? But so I think studying Ukraine, you know, to your question, like, yes, I think it's important. I don't think there is oversaturation, but at the same time, the way the student would propose to study Ukraine should be scholarly way, right? Not just to say like, here is Ukraine, it's an important country, right? Many important things are happening there. I want to study Ukraine. Like, what exactly do you want to study, right? And why is it that whatever question you want to study is a scholarly question, right? So in other words, if you could link it to some debate in the literature, right? Like say, there are discussions about causes of corruption, right? Some you know, studies say that what allows country to, you know, successfully conquer corruption are these factors. And some other studies say that actually institutions maybe are more important, right? Like there's actually a debate in this study, like I'm just giving as an example, right? In the study of sort of what makes for less corruption and more successful rule of law. Right. And Ukraine is a very interesting case because, you know, first of all, there is some corruption. Second of all, you know, there are different reforms are happening. And I am proposing, you know, that I'm interested in investigating this academic debate, right, about what factors make a country more or less corrupt on the example of Ukraine, right? So that would be the exactly kind of thing that I think students should be doing in their application. So the fact that they want to focus on Ukraine is fine. And I think it's now, especially in this climate, I would say it's an advantage. But they also have to link their interest in the study of Ukraine to some kind of scholarly sets of questions, right? So not just to say like, Ukraine, corruption, I want to study corruption in Ukraine. Like, that's great, but like, how are you going to study it, right? Like, is there some literature you want to speak to, right? Like, what do you already know about this topic? So I think that this is where I would encourage students to put kind of more emphasis on. But in general, like, I don't think there is, like, that it's like nobody's more interested or too many students. Like, that's not the case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Shevell. Thank you for this amazing time. I think we've all got so much food for thought, and we would be very happy to greet you in person in our premises at Vasil Nazarevich Karazin, Kharkiv National University. The day it becomes possible, it will be a great honor to us, and I will definitely forward all the future links to all our upcoming events to you, and hopefully you will join. We're going to have Professor General Justice with us in a week. So if you kindly permit, I will definitely send you the link, and hopefully we will be seeing you again.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this amazing lecture. Thank you very much for your time, for your fantastic support, and glory to Ukraine.
Do students have any questions? No? I don't see any hands, but if any students have any questions.
It looks like the audience needs to
the audience needs to digest it.
A little bit on everything they've heard.
I think there is a question there. No, like something.
There is one. Would you please, Marina, dear Marina?
Hey, yes, if it's possible, I can mention this question. It's okay?
Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Marina Rosen, and I'm representative from Karazin University Psychological Department. Although now I am currently living in Sweden and I'm not working in Karazin University. I now have a job in Mid-Sweden University. And my question is related to new concept that combine two branches in psychology. It's positive psychology, Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi, concept of flow, one side, and another side is development psychology and development personality that each was very raised in psychological department in Karazin University. Dusovitsky's theory of personality, for example, this is my teacher. And my question is, maybe you can guide me and give me tips how to best to represent this concept to American scientific society. Maybe some, I know that's better to publish some article, and I'm doing my best, but maybe you can give me some tips, who is the best to show this concept, and maybe have got feedback and develop this concept better.
Yeah, I can only give very general advice because I'm not in a psychology field, so I don't know sort of any specifics of this research. But in general, if you want, like in any of these social sciences disciplines, right, the way that these new concepts and new ideas are presented are often at big conferences, right?
Yes.
So what I would say that, and usually each discipline has its own like annual flagship conference. So American, say political, there is an association. So there's probably something called American Psychological Association, right? American Association of Psychology Professors, right? Because there is one for every discipline. So I know in political science, it's called American Association of Political Science. It is a professional organization that pretty much all political scientists in America belong to. So I imagine there is a similar association in psychology, right? For psychology professors. And then they usually have annual conference. I mean, there could be additional conferences, regional conferences, so forth, but there is usually every year, once a year, there is this big conference where pretty much everybody comes in. I think for political science, we get like 6,000 people. It's huge. So, I mean, psychology may be even bigger because some people, like, they don't necessarily teach, they practice psychology, so it will be a big forum, right? And there is a procedure to submit a proposal for a conference like this. So what I would say, I would look into, when this conference is meeting next, when is the deadline for the proposal, and send your paper proposal. So if you're writing a paper on this, even if it's not yet published, it's totally fine. It doesn't have to be published work, but you would send in a proposal, and if it's accepted, then you will get to present at the conference. Just one, at this conference, and then you can obviously meet other colleagues and sort of take it from there. Just one thing I would mention, I am imagining it's the same in psychology, although I'm not 100% sure, but in political science, it is easier because this annual conference is usually quite competitive, meaning that more people apply than they have spots, for admission, that they can accommodate papers. And usually it increases your chances if you're applying as a part of a panel. Meaning you don't just send your individual proposal, but you cooperated with maybe 2 or 3 other colleagues and you put together a panel, right? So then you're applying as a panel. You see what I'm saying? So if so if you have other colleagues, I mean, I'm saying it's in in political science, it's not required. You can send in individual proposal. You don't have to apply with anybody else. Or you could cooperate with other colleagues who work on different but related topics, right? And you can make a panel with like 3 presentations, a chair and a discussant, right? And then you apply with this panel proposal. Usually, panel proposals have higher chance of getting accepted than individual papers. So that's the only thing that I would say. So I'm imagining it's something very similar for psychology, but I wouldn't know 100%.
I see. Possible. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Dear audience, do we have more questions, please, to our presenter? With your kind permission, if questions appear, I will be very happy to resend them to you. And once again, dear audience, I will try to forward as soon as possible all the slides that dear Professor Shevel kindly provided. I made some photos myself with her kind permission. I will do that ASAP.
Yeah, I'll send you the slide deck right now, and then you can.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Legeda. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, students. Good luck to all of you who are going to apply. If any questions come up in the process, let me know. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank you, dear Professor Shevel, for your time and for this fantastic input. We've got so much to think and so much to share with our students.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.